Within this room, we have a lot of folks that spend a lot of time building systems. But at the end of the day, scale needs to come through systems, but also through people. And so, as we know from research around social capital, just like students that go through institutions of our own, it's not always the education and sort of what they know, but it also has a lot to do with who they know. We want to really think about the connections that our youth are making to help drive the opportunities in front of them, drive their ability to participate in accelerated pathways. So we are lucky that we are joined today by Professor Alan Daly to help us think a little bit more about the connections and networks that matter for our youth and how we can help them leverage those to ultimately find success. Alan has worked in a number of positions across K-12 and higher education, from the classroom up in administration, and now is at UC Santa Barbara, where he is the program director for the Center for Education Leadership and Effective Schools. His interest and focus really is around social capital and maximizing and leveraging social networks to improve systems, to expand reach, to ultimately lead towards scale. Alyssa and I have both had the great pleasure of working with Alan in a number of different scenarios, and we're really excited that he's been able to come join us today to talk a little bit about his research and a little bit about how you all can hopefully leverage youth and the power of your networks and the power of their networks to deliver greater outcomes. So let's give Alan a warm round of applause and welcome him to Accelerate.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? This is how I'm feeling right now. I feel a little bit like these amazing people at ESG have sort of gotten this backwards. Because what you're supposed to do is to have like okay warm-up bands, and then the main act comes on, you're like, wow, that was epic. These guys have done this in complete reverse. So I'm following the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and you're about to hear Bob's trombone band. So thanks to the organizers for putting me in that position. Some special place for you, I'm sure. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. It's a real honor and privilege to be here. As Ryan said, I've got this connection between research and practice, K-12 and higher ed, so I feel very much at home in this room. I also want to give a big shout out to Alyssa and Ryan and Christy at ESG who have been fantastic in helping me feel welcomed and really connected to the important work you all have underway. So for the next hour-ish, Bob's Trombone Band is going to take you through some musical toe tappers to get you energized even more for the afternoon. But let's start here. So I was fortunate enough to spend some time on a Fulbright in Sub-Saharan Africa. I got to spend about 5 months in Africa, working in township schools in South Africa in a variety of places. And while I was there, I was introduced to this idea around Ubuntu. And it's captured in this really nice phrase. I am because we are, and we are because I am. In other words, I exist here in this moment, in this time, because all of you are here. And all of you exist in this moment and in this time because I am. It breaks down the barriers between the individual and the collective to indicate that both are important, both are needed to connect. And at the heart of all of that, I think, is about relationships, thought of in really deep and systematic ways. I want to start here in 1963. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King was sent to jail in Birmingham, Alabama for standing up for what he believed in. While in jail, Dr. King pens a really powerful letter. I've taken an excerpt from that letter. You've probably seen this quote before. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. It's this idea about a network of mutuality, an inescapable network of mutuality, that I want to suggest is really important for our work. So, a little bit of background that will help you understand why I'm so passionate about this work. I'm the first in my family to go to college. For how many in the room is that true? A goodly number of you. Certainly for the students that you serve, a goodly number of them. Nobody in my family knew about college. They didn't know the magical dances or the secret handshakes one had to do to get into college. And I was connected to public education in a really important way by this incredible lady here. That's my grandma. She was incredibly important to me. She worked in public ed. I'll tell you what she did in a minute. But she wanted something for her better for her grandchild. She wanted a better future. Not to be scraping by. Not having to work when she had to leave school, when she had to leave her own school in 6th grade. Or my parents just making it through high school. My grandmother also had another really powerful skill. If you take a look at that haircut, she was most excellent at the bowl cut. I offered to provide those to anyone who would like. I picked up the skill in my DNA, kind of. But she did something that changed the trajectory of my life. She introduced me to a guy who needed some weeds picked in his yard. I know I'm from California, but it's not that kind of weed. And so I was probably would have been more productive and I would have made a lot more money. Nothing wrong with that weed. So that guy had gone to college and he saw something in me. And he talked to me about what it was like to go to college and why that was so important and the potentials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then suddenly from being just this weird kid that nobody in my family could understand, which is still true today, I took this journey to go into college and to continue and to become a teacher, an administrator, and chair of my department myself. That one relationship changed the course of my life. Relationships matter in deep and powerful ways, and most of the time you don't even realize how much they matter. I told you my grandmother worked in public education. She did so for 30 years. As I approach my 33rd year in public education, which is hard to believe because I'm only 25, that's a funny bit, I'm reminded about how important we all are. So my grandmother spent 30 years. She worked in a cafeteria. She was a cafeteria lady. 30 years of her life. But not once during that entire time did anyone ever tell her that what she did mattered for student achievement. She was seen as a cog in the machine, not valued for the gifts that she brought, and the knowledge that she had, and the connections she made with kids. You see, the problems we're facing, as you all know, are seemingly intractable. So we need everyone. We need everyone to be recognized, to be connected, to be seen as important in the purpose and the meaning of what we have underway. And I know this cafeteria lady business because that's my mom, who a couple years ago died, also spent 25 years working as a cafeteria lady. So it took everything in my soul not to run around and pour you all drinks when I saw them making a snack station. But my grandmother had something else that was really incredible. She really connected to this idea about wonder and joy in life. I thought I'd illustrate that in kind of a strange way. Well, you can tell me if it's strange. So you've probably gone to the grocery store at some point and had your cart waiting in the beginning, and you tossed in a candy bar or some potato chips or something. You did an impulse buy, right? During the pandemic, I impulse bought a house. So we decided to live in San Diego. We're like, wow, we should get a place in New Mexico. The interest rates, it seemed like a really reasonable idea at the time. Very much like pushing a cart and loading it full of chocolate bars, it turns out. But one of the best things about having this place in New Mexico is the owls. We have these awesome, epic owls. And there's something about the owls that I love. Something about their thoughtful faces, or the way that they hoo, or whatever it is that the owls do. So as a researcher, I went down a rabbit hole about owls. Remember, this is in the spirit of joy and wonder. It turns out that owls have freakishly long legs. Now, this is a kind of a very, for most of you, you're not going to remember anything else. Except for this. Now, yeah, so it turns out that owls, I want to encourage you to do this, just maybe not during the conference get-together here. Because you can watch owls run. There's all kinds of things that happen with these legs. But the point is, I don't know what I thought was going on with the owl, whether it just had a very stubby little leg, and that was it. I probably honestly didn't give it very much thought, honestly. But when I discovered this fabulous fact, and now I share it all with you who aren't going to remember anything else that I say, it just reminded me that the world is a place of wonder. And sometimes we get so divorced from that. And our relationships and our connections open that up. Okay, I'm just talking now because I know about 15 or 20 people are already snapping pictures of this. This has already been posted somewhere. ESD, I'm super sorry, but this is where your conferences de-evolved. So let's talk about this idea and keep in mind joy and wonder in the world. Does anyone know that's a picture of? Siena. Krakow's a good guess. Siena. So it's a famous little town in Tuscany. I'm going to guess some of you may have been there. This is a famous square, by the way. And when you look at this square in Tuscany, what's your eye immediately drawn to? Tower, right? That sort of stands, it sort of is on top, it captures your attention and imagination. Rarely do we pay attention to the square. What I'm arguing today is that we've got to shift our focus off the tower, where the elites are, the very few folks, to move to focusing our attention on the square, where lives are lived, loves are born, relationships are formed and dissolved. When we shift our focus from the tower to the square, it opens up new possibilities in the way that we think about it. Let me give you an example. So you've all heard of DARPA. A few years ago, they launched this red balloon contest. So here's the idea behind this red balloon contest. They wanted to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the internet, so they devised this sort of fabulous DARPA-esque kind of challenge. And what they're going to do is to have 10 weather balloons stationed across the country. They weren't going to tell anybody where these weather balloons were. They were going to try to do this contest where people figured it out. Now, just in case weather balloons aren't high on your list where you're still thinking about the owl legs, weather balloons are big. They're like 10 foot wide. So they're not little tiny party balloons. These are big balloons. So DARPA decided to hide 10 of them across the U.S. And so they announced this contest. The winning team comes from MIT. It's going to be interesting in a minute because I'll tell you how this happened. So they learned about the contest on a Tuesday. They announced their strategy on a Thursday. And let's see what happened. So my question to all of you is, how long did it take to find 10 randomly placed 8-foot bright red weather balloons suspended 30 to 50 feet above the ground, randomly placed in the continental United States? So you don't have to shout it out, but just think about how long you think that would take. So you're open to joy and wonder, I think. So it took 8 hours, 52 minutes, and 41 seconds. That's all. Now, that's a pretty incredible thing. Remember, we're talking about these balloons scattered across the United States. So this is a picture of where they were, so you get an idea. And what MIT did is they took a social network strategy. They set up this whole system where folks would call other folks that they knew, who would call other folks who they knew across the entire United States until they were able to find out exactly where all these winning points were. That was far and away the most winning strategy. DARPA conducted a post-analysis of what happened. And they rank here in this analysis that they wrote up. The contest revealed several promising means for using social networks to mobilize groups of people for a specific purpose. It demonstrated the speed at which social networks can be used to solve challenging national problems. We underestimate this. We talk about relationships, we talk about the importance of them, we talk about these connections, but are we really leveraging them in thoughtful and deep ways? And I would argue that this red balloon contest that I'm talking about is a metaphor for the ways in which we consider how knowledge and connection is created, supported, aggregated, disseminated, and scaled. I'm just going to pause and we appreciate metaphors be with you. Okay, we're done? Thanks for that. The person's actually my cousin. So not only is this a metaphor, it's also an analogy for the way that we might collaboratively work together to co-design and scale our work. So what if we guided ourselves? What if we guided our thinking? What if we guided our partnership work in this exact way? What if we put this front and center? Because when we do that, we can create incredibly powerful networks. This is some work you did around teacher to teacher at scale. You're looking at a network of a couple 100,000. We also can help networks to evolve if we're intentional and strategic about them. But we have to put that energy first. This is from another study in which we track the movement of knowledge between a group over a long period of time. We have the power to be able to do this, to make these connections in deep and powerful ways. But what are some of the conditions that we have to think about? Number one, for many of you, you're in the process of innovating, which we all are in some way. So what do we know from the research around catalyzing innovation? So we tell you about a big study that was done over the course of 5 years. It included 154 public organizations and about 3.5 million employees. We're talking about big data, big scale, trying to figure out what helped to catalyze innovation. What were the drivers? So what they find in the end of this study is something called ideation rate. So it's the number of ideas approved over leadership that they're going to execute on and implement over the total number of active users in the system. I don't want you being too caught up in the ideation rate, because what I'm going to talk to you about are what are the levers that help support ideation. There are 4 of them. The last one I'm going to share was found to be the most important one. So how do we catalyze innovation? 1, we engage more folks in deep and meaningful ways. So it's reaching out to folks who you don't know. That's entirely what this convening is about. Is us building these relationships across, within, bonding with each other, and bridging to other groups. So number 1, you want to catalyze innovation, get more folks involved. Second, increase the frequency of ideas that are shared and put forward. Get more people, get around the table, get those ideas out. Third, engage with the ideas. Wrestle with them. Try them on. See how they fit. The last lever is far and away the most important one, or at least that's what this research suggests. In order to catalyze innovation, you've got to have a diversity of perspective and input. If my grandmother was sought for her counsel and her knowledge, she would have a lot of things to contribute. Nobody bothered to invite her to the table. You see, what we're finding in this world now, in our own world, is that we are being defined by our differences rather than being strengthened by them. We are forming camps and divisions, regardless of where you sit. This hasn't always been the case. When Lincoln was running for president, he was facing a similar situation. These were the grizzled old white guys, that's how they look from today, that he was running against at the time. And they were vehemently opposed, angry, fighting. This is a famous picture of the sign against nation proclamation. If you look closely at that painting, what you're going to see are some of the folks that Lincoln was running against during that election year. This is well documented and argued by Doris Kearns Goodwin in a book called The Team of Rivals. It talks about the power and the potential of having folks that see the world in very different ways, to open up new spaces. We see the same in the world. For those of you that are studying this, there's something called an edge effect. This is where two biomes come together, like a woodland and a meadow. And where they meet is the greatest amount of biodiversity, way more than the meadow itself or in the forest itself. So this point in which two very different things intersect allows for a greater opportunity of connection. In fact, what the research really shows us really clearly is that strong ties with folks from diverse backgrounds of any kind of way supports innovation and realized potential. Your job while you're here is to sort of reach out, to make those connections. Because we know that social connectivity is incredibly important. Now, you already know I have a thing about birds. I've revealed that already. I'm going to illustrate social connectivity by talking about chickens. This is Bob's trombone band at its best. So there was a guy named William Muir. This dude was fascinated with chickens. His whole jam was to try to figure out how to make chickens produce more eggs. Like, how did chickens crank out more eggs? Like shooting eggs out all over the place. Shooting things. So he devised a really interesting experiment. He took two groups of chickens. And the first group was an average, you're not wondering where the hell, where's this going? For the love of God, bring back the Ed Talk people. So this guy brought together an average group of chickens, average fluffy and plumpiness and other metrics and one measures about a chicken. And these chickens had in common that they're producing about an average number of eggs. Okay, got it? So we got a group of chickens, and he leaves them alone for 6 generations to do their chickeny thing. Okay? But this is where the genius comes in. He said, wait a second. What I ought to do is I ought to put together a group of super chickens. Now, if you're ever out in the barnyard and you're trying to figure out the difference between a regular old chicken and a super chicken, the super chickens always have an S on their chest. Very easy. It's very easy to identify. Ask anybody in here knows. So what he did is he created a flock of super chickens. So these particular chickens were shooting out eggs all over the place way more than the average chickens. Remember what his goal is, right? His goal is to find chickens that can produce more eggs. That's his goal. So he leaves these super chickens alone for 6 generations to do their chickeny thing. Okay, you got it? So we got 2 groups of chickens, average and super chickens. We got the S on the chest. Now, after 6 generations have passed, what did he find? Please come back for the next convening and we'll tell you. Just kidding about that. I'll never make anybody back here again. So, for the average group of chickens, he found that they were fully feathered and plump and doing just fine, and their productivity had increased a little bit. Okay? Not much, but a little. Now, what about the second group? Remember, these are the super chickens. I'm not going to ask you to reveal these dark thoughts that you have. I'm going to ask you, what do you think happened to that second group of super chickens? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. All but 3 were dead. So, it turns out that the super... Didn't see that coming, did you? Since we're heading down the path, we just took a hard left. We got owl legs, dead chickens, and some other kind of stuff. Bob's trombone, man. So, what these super chickens did is they suppressed the productivity of the others. They wanted to become the uber chicken. Not a chicken you call up an app to ride around on. That's a different kind of a thing. But they wanted to become the uber chicken. Okay, so there is some point to this, he says confidently. And I'm sure it's going to be on the next slide, I'm sure of it. So what we know is we know that for a long, long time, we've operated in a super chicken model. Right? We've given, success comes from paying attention to the few, giving them all the resources and letting them do their thing. Focused on the tower, in essence. But there must be a better way to live. There must be a better way to engage. There must be a better way to scale. So let me tell you about some studies that suggest that and give you some empirical workarounds. So the question is, what is it that makes some groups sort of operate more effectively, higher productivity, whatever it might be, than other groups? So we've done some of these studies, and folks have done a lot of these other studies where researchers bring in a bunch of folks, they separate them into 2 random groups, and then they give them really hard puzzles to do. And what do they find? Well, they find maybe what you would expect, that it isn't the group that has the highest average overall IQ or intelligence measure. It isn't the group that has like some standout Einstein that can solve these things. Rather, they find 3 key core areas. And some large proportion of this audience is about to be very happy in a second. Far and away, the most important thing they find is high social sensitivity to each other. That they led with the social sensitivity as opposed to the technical elements of the task at hand. Second, the successful groups provided equal voice, equal time. Remember what I told you about catalyzing innovation, about these diverse perspectives and hearing those voices? They gave equal time. They also did a couple of other interesting things. If you ever listen to groups talk, and you could even observe it not here but somewhere else, there's a lot of advocacy talk that happens in work teams. I think we should do this, we should do this, let me tell you about this, let me tell you about my head. There's a lot of that. And there's less inquiry, being oriented towards asking questions and seeking to understand. But in the groups that did really well, there was a balance between inquiry and advocacy. You need people to advocate for ideas, of course. But we've got to balance those things. They also found something else interesting. The groups that were really successful had a balance between positive to negative commentary. Meaning that you need the critical voice to help you move forward, but too much of that kills the team. So imagine in spaces that were actually intentional and strategic about the kinds of talk that we did. And we actually fed back to one another the kinds of talk that we engaged in. By the way, this shows up in other studies. There's another study called Project Aristotle. It was conducted by Google after they took out all my owl searches. So they looked at all the teams in Google, and they looked at what are the qualities of effective teams. And they found all the things you're seeing up here, like around impact and meaning and structure and clarity and dependability, but far and away, the most important element, far and away, bar none, way more important than the other things, was this idea about psychological safety. to be able to feel seen, to express their vulnerability, to feel heard and seen. So it's about the social sensitivity. And yet we just sort of breeze over that all too often instead of reconnecting in intentional ways, not just by giving some voice, but by really engaging. Okay, I talked to you about some nonsense, super chickens, owls, whatnot. I'd like to just have a quick table conversation before we move into this idea around social networks. If you can only imagine what bird-related references I might have waiting for you on the other side. So, take a couple minutes, have a conversation with your table team around what some of these ideas suggest for you and your work, and what they also mean for how we scale what it is we do. So, go ahead and engage, and I'll pull you back together in a couple minutes. Just listen to the sound of my voice. We're going to have a little bit more time to dig into some of the ideas a little bit more. Just wanted to present a couple other ideas for you to think about. And before we do that, I realize that all my excitement to stop talking and have you talk. One of my colleagues very much reminded me that I didn't talk about number 3, so thank you, dear colleague. Typical mansplain thing. So it turns out, in the effective groups, most of them, they tend to have more women in them. There is a small caveat to that. If there were too many women, things didn't go well. So, yeah. Somebody just made the international symbol of, by the way, I don't think I shared this with you, for super chickens, the international symbol for pecking each other to death is something like this. So my dear friend up here said, yeah, they probably pecked each other. So thank you for that, I appreciate that. Here we go, let's talk about social networks. When we talk about social networks, I'm going to bring you to the south of France. We're going to go to this place. Does anyone know what this is? Let me ask this in a different way. Does anyone care what this is? So this turns out to be this painting by Van Gogh. And it's called, and this is going to be a theme of Van Gogh you're about to see in a minute, it's called The Yellow House in Arles. It's named that because it's a yellow house. That's the reason it's named that. You're going to see this convention that's going to show up. You'll see why I'm emphasizing this now. The yellow house is famous for a couple of reasons. It's famous in the art world because if you look at the roof of the yellow house, it's really orange. If you've ever been to Arles, there aren't orange roofs there. Van Gogh does this as an innovation. What he's trying to highlight is the blue of the sky. So we use the orange to set off the blue. That was one of the big innovations that comes out of this painting. That's not the reason I'm sharing this painting with you. I'm sharing it with you because in the late 1800s, Van Gogh moves in there. And he's got a big dream. His big dream is he wants to create an artist colony. He wants all different artists from all over the world come together. At that time, Van Gogh is producing incredible works, some of which you've no doubt seen before. Are you ready for this? Cafe at Night and Sunflowers. Not the most original guy, but the work is nice. So he's creating stuff. And he wants to get this artist colony going. So what he does is he writes letters to his brother Teal. They wrote back and forth a lot. I had the privilege of spending some time in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. To be perfectly honest, I don't remember very much else of the trip except that bit. And I got to go and look at the letters that he wrote. And I had a scholar there with me that would be translating them, explaining what they were talking about. Got one of the letters, took a picture of it, and then had him translate. And there's this beautiful beautiful thing that Van Gogh says as he writes it to you. He says, you know, I've always thought it ridiculous for painters to live alone and create. You always lose when you're isolated. You are all artists and designers. When we think about ourselves as artists and designers, it opens up new spaces for us to do the work. This is a picture of Van Gogh's last painting. A lot of people think it's the crows in the wheat fields, right? You remember that picture here? This is the international symbol for crow, just in case you're wondering. We learned two international symbols today. So you see that? That's not really his last painting. This is his last painting. Does anyone have any idea what that's a painting of? Trees is close. Toward the end of Van Gogh's life, he becomes obsessed with the roots of trees. These are tree roots from an olive tree. So he becomes obsessed, paints lots of paintings about the roots of the tree. Now this actually turns out to be a really powerful foreshadow of some really interesting science. Has anyone heard of the Wood Wide Web? I realize it's very Elmer Fudd-y. Some of you don't know who Elmer Fudd is, but it's very Elmer Fudd-y. And so it's based on some really interesting science. Here's the science. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about trees. Here we go. It's going to be deep science about trees. I am at the University of California. We've got to step up our game. Here we go. The trees have trunks, branches, and leaves. How are we doing so far? They also have roots, which is kind of cool. You've heard about that. There's some picture about Van Gogh. But what scientists are finding is they're finding that trees are actually communicating or interacting with one another. So there's roots under the ground, right? All manner of roots from all different kinds of trees. If you were to go out in the woods and dig a hole, you'd see a bunch. You shouldn't do that, by the way. But if you did do that, you'd see a bunch of roots. It turns out that the roots are connected by fungi. So the roots of a pine tree are going into the forest, the roots of an oak tree are going into the forest. Their roots cross each other, but they're connected by this fungi. So in essence, under the ground, there's an interconnected system of the tree. And so scientists can map this out. They can map it out using social network analysis, the kind of stuff that I do in my research, the kind of stuff I'm going to talk to you about. And they find out some really interesting things. The first thing they found out is that when a tree is under attack in the wood, like a beetle or a bug or something else, they send out chemical signals through their roots, which effectively are connected to the fungi and the roots of the other trees, warning the wood that it's about to be under attack, so the other trees can deploy chemical response. That's crazy and powerful. But that's not all. The other thing, and it's represented by this graph here, the big green dots on the outside are called nodes. Those represent older trees that are in the network of these connections. So what turns out is the older trees die. They send out chemical resources through their roots, connected by the fungi, to the roots of the younger sapling that might be struggling to get sunlight or to grow. Why do we get so separated from this as human beings? Of this core idea of looking out for each other, of care, of connection. We become so enamored by the technical things that we can do that we've lost sight of our own humanity, our shared humanity, the potential and the promise to fundamentally make a difference. So this work is talking about what's hidden in plain sight. You didn't think I was going to let the owl thing. And what it suggests is it suggests we're going to shift a little bit from this almost sole focus on human capital, like what's important, the technical elements of what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all important business, right? Don't back away from here besides saying, wow, that's weird. Owls have long legs. There's a thing called super chickens, and human capital doesn't matter. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's really vitally important. But it often overshadows this idea around social capital. So what we're talking about here is, what does it look like to intentionally flip the script? What does it look like to actually lead with social capital and follow with the human? To be intentional and direct and strategic about it. So to do that, we've got to break free of a lot of constraints that have been imposed upon ourselves. Some of them self-imposed, some of them imposed from the outside. The first is this: formal systems. This metaphor has guided us as organizations in thinking for a long, long time. It says some really important things. Number one, there's an all-knowing, all-seeing red eye at the top of the thing, right? There's a bunch of discrete boxes, each doing their own thing. Probably all of your organizations have these work charts. I don't mind them. But this has guided us for a long time. But to me, this is more like what the world is like. It's a set of relationships and connections that isn't always so obvious, and yet we intuit them in some ways. In your own organizations, there are times you need to get some budget stuff done, and if you call up Bob in the budget office, he's a pain in the neck to deal with. So you call up Jose, who's always really friendly and actually gets stuff done. But then you don't tell anybody about Jose, because you want everybody going to Jose. So in essence, you hold on to social capital, it creates inequitable opportunities for everybody else in the organization. Right? You have this. I guess this is a principle. We had a mold problem, not on your face mold, but the digging kind of mold. So I should just call the facilities guy to take care of that. But the facilities guy didn't want to play whack-a-mole. But I had a really good connection with the food service people. My grandma connection that tells me a lot in my life. And she was the first cousin to the whack-a-mole guy. I call her, she calls him, my moles get taken care of. Other people had mold problems because mold just left my house and went to somebody else. How do we create the opportunities for that? And also, how do we break this idea about titles and positions? Because while in the formal structure, there's the all-knowing, all-seeing I. In the informal structure, that person is actually quite marginalized. There are informal leaders at operations in your organizations and your partnerships that you may or may not be aware of. They play an outsized, influential role on what you're trying to execute. If we get all caught up in titles and roles, then we miss the opportunity. You see, we have to think of things from a social structural standpoint. That we all have relationships. We exist in this network of relationships. We are in an inescapable network of mutuality. This is a network map of the play of Hamlet. So this might say two things to you. One, super interesting. Two, needs to get out more. I'm really hoping the first one's right, because I already know the second one is right. So just mapped out the relationships of play Hamlet and asked about ally relationships. Who's an ally and whom? This creates a social structure. Imagine in your partnership work, we sort of were able to understand this social structure. And to think about where the leverage points are, where the bottlenecks are, where the opportunity spaces are. Because they exist in folks that we aren't even aware of. This is a social network map of a real school. It's an elementary school. Each dot on that map represents a teacher from the elementary school. They are colored by grade level. So the blue at the top maybe is the 5th grade, the green one's maybe the 3rd grade, etc. The line between them represents the sharing of best practices. When you're looking at this, you may also notice a bunch of dots off to the left. That's not some UCSD printing problem. Those are folks that don't turn to anybody for best practices, nor does anyone turn to them. There's lost capital in the system. What we have to do is to be aware of where those isolates may be, and not overly focus on them, but rather ask ourselves the question, how do we make sure everybody is connected? How are we intentional, and how are we strategic about that? Now, this school wasn't doing fabulously. Let me show you another school that's about 3 miles down the road. Similar student population, similar teaching population, trying to control as many variables as possible here. Everything else otherwise is the same. Now, if I was to ask you which school is doing better, of course you would likely say the bottom one, and you would be 100% correct. That's actually not the interesting bit here. The interesting bit is what the system decided to do in response when we shared this data back. They immediately got into technical human capital mode. And they're like, we gotta train, we gotta have PD, we gotta have people like there, we need to make sure we're on page 10 at 10:30 in the morning. Okay, I'm using school as an example, but it doesn't matter. I've got the same data from higher ed. I can show you math departments, English departments, econ departments, any of these, it doesn't matter. These are people systems. So the district comes in and says, okay, what we need to do is have this training and get everybody to say, okay, that made some incremental improvement. But they never reached the level of that second school. So here's the real big takeaway message from today. Any innovation, any change, anything that you want to do, if you're really interested in scale and moving things, is always layered on top of an existing base state of relationships. And that existing base state of relationships may well determine the speed, the depth, and the breadth of what you're trying to get across. Because all too many folks are like, oh well, that didn't work. Oh well, this partnership thing seems great, but that didn't work. We reach those conclusions because we underestimate the outsized influence of these social networks that are hidden in plain sight. Your challenge is how do we make them more explicit? How do we understand them better? Should we not do that, all the important and key work that we have underway is going to be for naught. This is what I'm saying to you. Another network map. Red nodes represent folks that work in a central office in the school district. Blue represent those that work in a school, like a principal. The nodes on the left, again, are isolates. This is about a device relationship. You may be interested to know that the guy in the middle retired. That's funny what it is somehow. Effectively breaking the system into two. I'm going to posit to you, you've either worked in systems like this or you're in a system like this. What does it take to create these redundant relationships? And we can think about this across hundreds of people. This is a network of 350 people. I want to highlight something really important in this one, and this is notion around bridging and bonding. This is exactly how Alyssa and Ryan and the team have designed this experience. It's around bridging and bonding. Let me explain what I mean. The science is really clear about this, that bonding relationships, in other words, within team relationships, are incredibly important to build and develop. They're important because they transfer norms, they help people to understand the way things are done around here, they help people to be aware of what's happening. They're incredibly important. They're rich sources of trust and care and vulnerability if done well. Incredibly important. But bridging ties, those that connect partnerships, maybe other folks you're not as well connected to, are also incredibly important to be intentional about. Because it is through those bridging ties that novel and new information comes in. In a strongly connected group, it's likely you know what everybody else knows in that group. And that's good, norm development, how did you practice, etc. But you need the influx of weak ties or bridging ties to help you go get something done. So I can't stress enough to you while you're here to continue that bonding experience. And that's pretty much everyone's default thing. But to really work hard towards the bridging. And also to think about this over time. This is a set of leaders at the first year. The This is that same team at the end of 4 years. The green represents the new folks, red represents those that remain, and the light green, those that left. Your systems churn. How do you build in redundancy so that when that churn happens, you've got other folks still in place? So I'm mindful of the time I have with you. This is an exercise that you can all do at some point later, but it's a way for you to really ground what it is you're thinking and thinking about an ego network approach. In other words, you would jot down folks you work with, think about them, how close they are to you, that represents strong. And then I would ask you the question, who do you want to link together that you haven't otherwise linked yet? So it's a really simple exercise. Please feel free to take a picture of it. I encourage you and your teams to actually engage in this. Because the best thing about doing this is that you can make a Star Trek reference. And speak a little Latin. Like, this is kind of... This idea is called Tertius Young Gains. It's the third that joins. And if it isn't abundantly obvious to you at this point, which means you've probably been asleep during this entire thing, I'm a high-level nerd. So some of you are like, oh, he's quirky. Okay, that's just a little off, but all right. How about to blow your doors in with my high level of nerd? So I'm going to use Latin to describe an important network concept connected to Star Trek. Brace yourself. Bones, that's the doctor. I know some number of you are like, he's about to say Marsha, 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 or some other kind of like Gen X reference that no one will get. However, Bones is the doctor. He's a very emotional type of guy, very like driven by his emotions. Spock, the guy with the pointy ears, very rational, like systematic, etc. When the two of them are together, things are not always fabulous. Hiccups there. Captain Kirk's the guy in the front looking off in the distance in some kind of profound but arrogant way. When he shows up, the three of them kind of come together and are able to do way more together than they are individually. Kirk represents the third that joined. This is a fabulous network strategy. So here's the strategy, pretty simple. When you're going to a meeting, invite somebody else along. They don't have to know anything about what you're talking about. Invite them along. In fact, it's better if they don't know, because they're unencumbered with kind of the preconceived notions that you're going to bring to the party. By doing that, you expand a one-to-one relationship and you create even more relationships. Triadic relationships are the formation of strong groups. 3 is a really important number. They're a magical number if you watch cartoons back in the 80s. Okay, so let's bring this to a close. Although someone argued after about the third slide, it closed down. I've tried to take you to different places intellectually, emotionally, all manner of things. So here's our final journey together. We're going to Barcelona. And you're going to Barcelona. Thank you, Bill and Linda. Okay, so. Sorry to do that. Channel my inner Oprah. Okay, so we're not just going to Barcelona, we're going to Catalonia, like an area that Barcelona is in, right? And in Catalonia, which remember a while ago they wanted to be independent from the rest of Spain. Fiercely independent. The Catalans are fiercely independent. I'll give you an example of independence here. You're looking at a bull ring in Catalonia. Now, in Catalonia, they do not allow bullfighting. The rest of Spain, lots of fighting among bulls, and people here, no bullfighting. They reimagined these bull rings in the same way that we have somehow reimagined almonds into milk. So that's a big imagination. But what takes place here is something quite cool. It's called a human castle festival. Some of you may have heard of these human castle festivals. It's really cool. People show up, they dress in different colors to represent their village or their school or whatever it might be, and they come together because they're going to do something really amazing. I went and spent some time there, because one should go to places that have kava when you're studying things. And this is a picture of the base of the healing house. And I talked to these people and they said, what matters is that you can feel the arms of the person in front of you, and in turn you can feel our arms or hands on you. It's an incredibly strong, interdependent, interwoven system in which you can't tell the difference between the butcher, the baker, or the candlestick maker. And you need that kind of interdependent system, and you need that kind of connection, and you need to feel that you belong if you're going to build this. So what we were looking at was the base of this. So when I was there, I went and interviewed people, and I said, oh, come on, is the person outside yelling up really as important as the people in the middle? They're like, yes, everybody matters. Everybody's role is important. Everyone is critical. Particularly critical is the 4 or 5-year-old little boy wearing basically a bicycle helmet who climbs up to the top of this thing and raises his 4 fingers representing the stripes of the flag of Catalonia and pride in his village. Now, I asked what seemed to be a logical, normal question, which is, like, what if the kid freaks out? Which, by the way, seems a healthy response here. And they told me, we got a backup kid. Something, you didn't see that one coming either. We got a backup kid. But they were quick to then say, look, we celebrate the kid that freaked out as much as the one who's standing at the top. Because doing the hard work that we're all trying to do, that you all are trying to do every day. Sometimes we're going to slip, and sometimes we're going to freak out. But what's important is to know that we're part of something bigger. Part of something bigger that we created, we nurtured, and we scaled. So with that, I thank you deeply for joining me on this journey, and look forward to learning more about